My name is Kamij Ranavardi, co-president of ColumbiaDC and a graduate of the School of Engineering and Applied Science. Let me take this opportunity to thank our partners, MIT Club of DC and their members for joining us this evening. We are so honored to have University Professor Joseph Stiglitz from Columbia Business School and Graduate School of Arts and Sciences to discuss whether we have hit the rock bottom of inequality in the US and honestly, where do we go from here? We are also fortunate to have Thomas B. Edsall, adjunct professor of Columbia Journalism School and political journalist as our host. So please allow me to briefly introduce our speakers. I do encourage everyone to check our site for to see their full bios and references to their great body of work. Joseph Stiglitz is an American economist and a university professor at Columbia University, a recipient of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2001. He's a former senior vice president and chief economist of the World Bank and a former member of and chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Professor Stiglitz graduated from Amherst College, received his PhD from MIT in '67, and became a full professor at Yale in 1970. Before Columbia University, he has taught at Princeton, Stanford, MIT, and was Drummond Professor and a Fellow of All Souls College at Oxford. Our host, Professor Thomas Edsall, joined the full-time faculty at Columbia Journalism School after working for 25 years at Washington Post. Since 2011, Edsall has been writing a weekly online opinion column for New York Times. Awards include a Carey McWilliams Award of the American Political Science Association, the Bill Pryor Award of the Newspaper Guild, a year-long fellowship at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and 5 media fellowship at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. Edsall attended Brown University and received a BA from Boston University. With that, Tom, please take it away.
Let me first say it's an honor to be interviewing Joe Stiglitz. We have a limited time, so let me go directly to the questions. The questions are going to be short, but we are hoping that you will give us some long answers.
Okay.
That's what professors are supposed to be good at. In the post-World War II era, Democrats were the party of the working class. White blue-collar workers, union members, and a majority of voters without college degrees had turned their backs on the Democratic Party. What's happened?
Well, I think there are many things that have happened. It's partly that the dramatic changes in our economy happened faster than either party was able to adequately deal with. That we had globalization, financialization, deindustrialization, and that left many ordinary workers, industrial sectors particularly those without college educations, in a very bad position. And neither party had an adequate agenda to deal with them. And to be fair, no country has done a real good job. Some countries like Sweden have done a much better job than the United States, but it's been a challenge everywhere. The difference was that the Republican Party decided, at least this is my perspective, to take advantage of that discontent. In many ways, they were more responsible because at least the Democrats, as they opened up trade, they asked for trade adjustment assistance. They asked for more progressive taxation. They asked for stronger unions that would help fight for workers. And the Republicans opposed all those initiatives. But there was another trend going on, and that was a kind of racism. There was a conservative trend of going back to the past, and the Republicans seized on both of these, and we now have a very divided country, divided by education. You look at the polling numbers, the Democratic Party has become a party, as you said, of the more educated, the Republican of the less educated. The Democratic Party has become the party of the urban, the Republican much more rural. The Democratic Party has been the party of science and advancement, structural change. The Republican has been looking back into the past. And these are all, of course, correlated, but in a way it is become almost a kind of identity politics, tribal politics, more than a politics of policy, because I truly believe that the Democratic agenda is the agenda that would actually best serve the interest of those workers who have not done very well over the last 40 years.
What can the, go ahead, sorry.
You commented that professors answer at length. I could go on, but I assume we want to go on to some other questions, but I could go on this. It's really one of the most difficult issues that we face.
Well, let's continue a little bit on it. How much has the role of race in America hindered the ability of government to address the issues of inequality and of economic growth and improved jobs in general?
I think it has played an important role. I can't tell you to parse it out precisely, exactly. If you remember back, Ronald Reagan had this image of the welfare queen. Nobody ever found that welfare queen, but it was a very racial image of one group depending on government handouts. And that image caught the imagination of a lot of people, especially people who weren't doing very well. The reality, of course, is they never found that welfare queen. The reality that we've seen in the subsequent 30, 35 years is that dependency doesn't have a racial context. We are seeing, no matter how you parse it out, we are having problems, opioid crises, problems that we characterized at one time as racial. Family breakup is now characteristic of lower income people in general. And the reality today is that the American dream is now known to be a myth. What prospects of young American, no matter what his race, if he's born, it depends to a very high extent, more than in other countries, on the income and education of his parents. So we become a much more divided society. In many ways, the critical juncture in the reorganization of American politics is almost surely the Civil Rights Bill, which moved the South from the Democratic Party into the Republican Party. And one of the reasons why it played such an important role was that the Democratic Party before that was a complex coalition, which tamed some of the racism in the United States, because you brought together some of the more liberal, more tolerant elements, as well as some elements that were very strong and racist. But when that coalition fell apart after the Civil Rights Act, then you didn't have that taming force, and America became much more of this polarized society that I described, where you have the least educated, the more rural, and disproportionately white on one side, and the coalition on the other. So that was a defining event, which I think helps explain the history of the United States over the last some 60 years.
What can government do? You mentioned the changing economics really since the mid-70s, when you have globalization resulting in low-wage countries competing with us, with the shift of the kind of jobs that are growing to the ones that require higher skills. How can the government address these forces that are helping to drive inequality?
Well, I would begin by saying, let's do no harm. And these are forces that would be difficult to deal with on any condition. But unfortunately, what we've done is exacerbated that. So for instance, the laws weakening unionization. Unions would have been able to provide some protection of workers. We weakened the workers' bargaining position. So globalization weakened it, then labor legislation weakened it even further. When you think about bargaining power, it's workers versus corporations. And we weakened the laws taming corporations. We weakened antitrust laws. So we rewrote the rules of the American economy in ways that exacerbated the underlying forces for inequality. We could have gone the opposite way, and as I say, the countries that have been more successful have done that. We could have had active labor market policies that would have helped workers move from the industries of the past to the industries of the future. We could have had industrial policies that could have created more jobs in those places in the country that have been had such adverse effects. We could have engaged in lots of other policies that would have helped those who are facing these problems. You know, the United States is the only country that puts so much of the burden of tertiary education, university education, on the backs of young people and their parents. And our tuition is so much higher than in Europe. And so we've created another impediment to people adapting to this changing economic landscape. So while the percentage of college graduates has increased, it's not increased as much as it has elsewhere in the world. And finally, we could have taken a lot more active role in progressive taxation. We actually are one of the few countries that have regressive taxes. Those at the very top pay a lower percentage of their income in taxes than those below. And this undoubtedly has reinforced the disparities in our country.
In these circumstances, should markets retain a central role in the allocation of resources in such areas as innovation, healthcare, and energy?
Well, I think markets are a powerful force. but they need to be channeled, curbed, and one has to understand their place within the economic system. So by that I mean, in the first, they have to be regulated. Without regulation, they will pollute, they will exploit. We saw the problems in climate change. We're seeing the problems in pollution. We see the problems in the financial crisis of 2008, in Dieselgate, in the opioid crisis, in the childhood diabetes crisis. Markets have to be regulated. The tendency to exploitation is there. We have to recognize that. But if markets are tempered and tamed, they can be a powerful force. But even then, there's an important role for government. Most of our major innovations are based on basic science, basic research, and that rests on government support. The private sector is not going to do the basic research, the discovery of DNA, the basic developments that led to the internet, which we've become so dependent on in this era of COVID-19. So all the very large advances, at least disproportionate, are based on government support. So we have to understand that we need to both regulate, temper markets, and we have to complement them with good, what we call collective action, working together, mostly through government, but there are other ways of that people work together as well.
How does inequality affect democratic institutions and the U.S. political system? Is more inequality always bad, or is there an optimum level of inequality?
Well, there is some inequality that's always going to be with us. You need to have some inequality to provide incentives, but we don't have to have anywhere near the level of inequality that we have. I believe we actually are suffering because of the high level of inequality. I wrote a book called The Price of Inequality, that we are paying for a high price for the level of inequality and for the way it gets generated. And here I refer to what I said a few minutes ago. When you have inequality that's created by exploitation, whether it's an exploitation of market power or exploitation of individual vulnerabilities, exploitation in the form of the opioid crisis, or the food issues, all of these are kinds of inequality that are actually bad for the economic system and bad for our democracy. One of the ways in which inequality is so bad for our democracy is that it undermines trust in our society. It undermines trust because a lot of people rightly come to believe that it originates out of a rigged system, that the rules of the game have been written to advantage some at the expense of others. And let's be clear about it, they have been. The system is rigged. And probably no moment was this more glaring than when we had deregulation that allowed the banks to exploit others and to engage in excessive risk-taking. And then when the result of their bad behavior became evident and we went into financial crisis, we bailed out the banks to the tunes of hundreds of billions of dollars, allowing many Americans to lose their homes and their jobs. So that seemed to many people as an unfair system, a rigged system. But there's another way in which inequality is really bad for our democracy. You know, when we talk about the principles of democracy going back to the Enlightenment, we talk about the importance of checks and balances. Any school kid learns about checks and balances. But the problem is that checks and balances will not work in a society which is marked by too much wealth inequality. That somehow when there's too much wealth inequality, the voices of the very rich, the powerful, overwhelm the system. And that's particularly been true in the United States, because unlike other democracies, we've allowed money to matter more. We've allowed money to speak more loudly, especially after the Citizens United case, where, but there were some other cases where we let unbridled contributions, campaign contributions, and these, we call them contributions, but they were investments by corporations in order to get the rules and regulations, the system to work for them, but not for Americans more generally. So these are ways in which, in a fundamental sense, the inequality is really undermining our democracy.
When you describe the danger becoming when the economic system allows exploitative activities, how do you determine when you go past, say, normal profit making to exploitation? How can government determine that?
Well, there's always going to be, a fine line. There are going to be things at the margin, hard to tell, but not in the United States anymore. At one time you might have had a debate about it, but there is today a growing consensus among economists that at least a large part of America's inequality is associated with rent seeking, monopoly profits, monopoly power. And, we have ways of assessing the nature of that market power. Economists have devised, general guidelines for assessing it. And we're way over the marginal case. The abuses of our tech giants have been well documented and seen over and over again. And they paid billions of dollars in fines in Europe, even in the United States. So I don't think there's any question about that. You look at, there are indicia that makes you alert to the possibility, the likelihood of that kind of market power. And it's not only in the dramatic things like the digital giants, it's also in little things like dog food. You look at a sector where there may be 1, 2, 3, or 4 firms, and it's almost inevitable, almost, not always, inevitable with that degree of market concentration, there will be market power, and with that market power, there'll be abuse of market power. There's some dramatic cases that we see besides the one that I mentioned in the drug industry, where they raise prices 1,000 times the cost of production. There's no question there about market power, and no question about the abuse of market power. And there are other forms of exploitation, exploiting vulnerabilities. The opioid crisis represents a good example, and they're finally being held accountable. But you see the kind of machinations that the drug companies and the owners of those companies have gone to avoid accountability, moving their money out of the corporations as the corporation is being sued, going bankrupt, but meanwhile already have taken out their billions of dollars for themselves. So I don't think there's any question that the United States has been marked by high levels of this kind of exploitation and very broadly, really bad behavior.
What should Biden do, assuming he wins the presidency? What kind of legislation or regulation should he propose to address these questions?
Well, I think, the first thing is, before I come to legislation, is trying to bring the country together. We've had 4 years of extreme divisiveness. Yes, we have differences, but leadership involves bringing people together. Famous speech of Abraham Lincoln, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And we had a president that tried to make those divisions larger and larger and larger. So partly it's the stance you take of trying to, can we solve these divisions, reduce the divisions, bring people together? So that to me is the beginning. And that's what my reading is what he's been trying to do. Now, in terms of policies, concerned about inequality, I sort of outlined the two or three aspects of this. One of them is rewrite the rules of the American economy to make it more competitive, to reduce that market power, to reduce the opportunities for exploitation, to strengthen workers' bargaining power. So those are an important element. Sometimes people think that markets just exist in a vacuum. That there are no choices about what rules of the game, but there are, and different countries have different rules. And we rewrote the rules over the last 40 years in ways that contributed more to that inequality. The second thing is we need to have a tax and expenditure system that helps promote equality. And by that I mean things like education, making sure that there is educational opportunity for all. And that goes all the way from preschool to college. And we do very badly at particularly every step along the way. We reinforce inequalities of opportunity rather than trying to combat some natural inequalities that are always going to be there. We have to have access to healthcare. If you're not healthy, you're not going to be economically successful. And we don't have access to healthcare for many Americans. Nutrition, we don't have access to good food for many Americans. The recent data about how many Americans are going, millions of Americans going hungry facing a food shortage are really devastating. So we need to strengthen our systems of social protection and advancement of opportunity for everybody. And then, of course, we also have to make sure that those who are more able to pay their fair share. And that's not been happening in the United States.
All right. Looking at that agenda, how much has the Republican Party, which you probably know about Grover Norquist's idea of starving the beast. Now, the U.S. will shortly have a debt level that exceeds the GDP. Has the Republican Party, in effect, succeeded in constraining the government from doing just what you're suggesting?
I mean, it has been engaged in a 40-year campaign to denigrate government, reduce the scale of government. And, if we ask how well did government do in responding to the pandemic? We can say it succeeded in weakening government. It defunded the Centers for Disease Control, which are the point of our engaging in the pandemic. It tried to defund science, which is essential for our responding to something like COVID-19. Every year, Trump administration proposed 30% cuts. Fortunately, Congress did not go along with most of those. We had a White House office on preparedness for pandemics, and it disbanded that. And we had stockpiles to respond to an emergency, and they allowed those stockpiles to be depleted. So there has been a long-term agenda to weaken the efficacy of the government, and under Trump, they really did succeed in weakening the efficacy of the government. At the same time, they did not lead to policies that led to more growth. I mean, to me, the quintessential example of that is the December 2017 tax bill. I don't use the word tax cut because it was an increase in the tax rate for the vast majority of Americans when the bill was fully implemented in 2026, in order to finance a tax cut for our corporations and the billionaires. Now, the argument was the tax cut for corporations would lead to more investment. The evidence, we now know what happened. It didn't go for more investment. It went for more stock buybacks, more dividends. And the result of that was that, well, we got a short period of a sugar high, slight increase in growth. Even before the pandemic, the economy's growth was slowing and was actually becoming quite anemic, and was projected to be well under 2% for 2020 before the pandemic. So what was going on, what they succeeded in doing by that tax bill was 2020 was scheduled to be the first $1 trillion deficit, the largest deficit in peacetime, not in recession. Now, of course, the deficit has broken all bounds, 15% to 20% of GDP this year. Now, the question is, to what extent should that tie our hands as we think about the future? And the way I think about it is that we are going to need more government support. Our economy is going to need more government support if the economy is going to get back to anything normal anytime soon. There is something economists call hysteresis effects. If you allow the economy to go down, the damage is long-term, and it will make it harder and harder to recover, let alone the suffering that will go on in the interim, particularly the people at the bottom who are living paycheck to paycheck. So the agenda, the skinny package that's been proposed to deal with the COVID-19 is going to leave our economy devastated. So we need to spend money. That's absolutely clear. But we have to spend it smartly. And that means we have to spend it on areas where there are high multiplier, labor intensive to get jobs back. But most importantly, in my mind, in ways that accord with our vision of the post-pandemic economy. So that means COVID-19 has exposed the weaknesses in our economy, the lack of resilience, high levels of inequality, and pre-existing conditions like that we have not dealt with the problems of climate change have only gotten festered as the pandemic is going on. And we're seeing that in the fires in California, the floods in Iowa, the hurricanes. So these are things that we have to deal with. These are new risks that we have and old risks that we have to deal with. So the really important idea here is we have to make our money do dual purpose. It has to simultaneously help us recover from the pandemic and redirect our economy towards create, as it's been put, build back better. Some of the research I've done with colleagues at London School of Economics and Oxford have shown that, in fact, money that is directed in these ways, including climate change, can be just as or even more effective than other forms of spending.
Is there a tension or a conflict between an agenda addressing inequality and an agenda seeking to increase growth? Is there, or are they mutually reinforcing?
I think, at least at this time in the United States, they are mutually reinforcing. And that goes back, as I said, to what I referred to earlier, my book, The Price of Inequality. What I showed in that book, and a lot of empirical evidence since then, from the IMF, from the OECD, from a lot of scholars, is that an agenda that promotes equality can also promote efficiency and economic growth. And the reason for that goes back to what I said before. One of the reasons is that much of the inequality is associated with exploitation, market power, taking advantage of corporations of different individuals. Take the opioid crisis. It created more inequality, but a labor force that is unhealthy is not going to be a productive labor force. Take one of the aspects of inequality that has been so exposed by this pandemic, health inequalities. This is not an equal opportunity virus. It goes after the people who are sick, who have pre-existing conditions. If we had a better, more equal healthcare system, we would have a healthier population, and that would be a more productive labor force. If we have inequalities in educational opportunities, it means that we are not using our most valuable resource, our human resources, to their full. So I am very convinced that actually a equality agenda can actually lead to a more productive economy, faster economic growth.
Why is it in America has no social democratic tradition, and not even much less a socialist tradition? What is it about this country that seems to separate it from Europe and many other countries?
That's a very good question, and it really takes us beyond narrow economics. I can conjecture some of the elements that went into that. One of the elements that I think went into that was the antipathy between communism and the United States. We were at two extremes in that ideological battle. And for a while, the corporations were able to take advantage of that battle to make ideology, the ideological divisions, larger. But it's worth noting that you might say in the early decades of the Cold War under Eisenhower, there weren't the divisions that we have in the United States today. Under Eisenhower, the tax rate at the top was well over 70%. Under Eisenhower, we had large investments in infrastructure. We had the National Highway Program and education and research. Even under Nixon, we had the clean water. We had a number of environmental laws. So much of what the differences between the United States and Europe really seem to, and the rest of the world, you might say, really seem to have crystallized in the last 40 years. And it was really the success of the ideology of Reagan. And that may be linked to the issues of race that we talked about earlier. So that may play a role, but it's a subject that goes beyond economics into political science and history.
On that point, it seems to me your own history, your own work in economics has shown a growing interest in politics and political economy. Do you think economists generally should focus less on abstract theoretical arguments and focus more on political economy and politics?
I think they have to. And let me say why. And this goes back to, again, another earlier remark. Markets don't exist in a vacuum. The way things play out depends on the rules of the game. Where are those rules of the game set? They're set in political process. They're set in our democracies. But if our democracies are captured, if we have a democratic deficit as a result of money in politics or rules of the political game that allow minorities to determine our policies, then those policies will not reflect the interest of our broader society. So, you know, to me, in my more recent book, People, Power, and Profits, a progressive capitalism for an age of discontent, one of the things I describe is the fact that a vast majority of Americans are in favor of greater access to health care. A vast majority of Americans want large increases in our minimum wage. A vast majority of Americans believing more gun control, better regulated financial system, worried about climate change. Yeah, I could go through issue after issue, but the point is that actually the differences between the United States and the rest of the world in, you might say, a lot of these issues is not as great as it might appear in the way our parties look. The real discrepancy in the United States is that the voices of this majority that wants these kinds of changes that reflect a 21st century society and economy have not been able to get reflected in our political system.
I'm not sure if we now want to switch to questions from the audience.
Yep, I think we can do that. Hi, professors. My name is Miyako. I'm the admin for ColumbiaDC's alumni club here. And what I can do is read some of the questions that have been typed in already. And if you guys are listening, if you still have questions, go ahead and use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then I'll try and combine as many as we can so that we can get through them by 8 p.m. We do have a hard stop time. So maybe one of the first questions that came in when we started was that U.S. businesses have been overly focused on shareholder value as their purpose, which has been a change over the last few decades. And it almost seems like their mission is now
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a particularly good question given the timing. Next Sunday is the 50th anniversary of the publication in the New York Times of Milton Friedman's argument that companies should only pay attention to shareholder value. And that differs from what Europe and what American companies did in prior periods. I wrote a paper, a couple papers with my colleague Sandy Grossman in the 1970s, roughly around the same time, explaining that shareholder value maximization did not lead to societal well-being. That, of course, you needed to have government regulation and you needed to do a lot more. But even then, societal well-being, companies ought to pay attention to the workers, their customers, the environment. There were the community in which they operated. There were many other stakeholders, and their concerns ought to be brought on into it. And just because you could get away with making more profits by selling addictive products, whether they're cigarettes or opioids, exploiting others, you shouldn't do it. And there should be a broader standard for corporate governance than just shareholder maximization. Interestingly, right now, the Trump administration is trying to change the rules governing pension funds and other fiduciaries to make them focus just on short-term shareholder value, the value of shares in the short run, and exacerbating all the problems that we have.
Why would they do that?
The CEOs get paid on the basis of shareholder value. And so they've designed a system that works well for the CEOs more than anybody else. And so they use this rhetoric that companies should just be concerned. It's the CEOs of the companies. Now, what is interesting in terms of responding to the Friedman shareholder value maximization, the Business Roundtable just a year ago came out and said corporations should take a broader perspective. So they changed their minds from the view that they had had for a long time. They realized that shareholder value maximization had not served our society very well. And in response to that, I said, well, now there's a change in rhetoric. Let's see whether they actually will do what they've said that they're going to do and take a broader perspective, whether they will raise wages to a livable wage, whether they will reduce their pollution. Some have, some have not.
Great. Neil Tender asks or says that American demographics have been shifting over the past several decades, and that trend is continuing. How do you see this playing into inequality in this country moving forward?
Well, it plays in a number of complex ways. And it depends on what you mean by the demographics that we're talking about. There is a change in the age structure of the population. There are more older people. That obviously affects the politics because there are clear divides between younger and older people on many of the issues that are very germane that we've been discussing. There's an urban-rural movement. Again, there's a movement from the rural to the urban sector, to the urban. And again, a lot of the differences that we've been talking about, political differences, are related to the urban-rural divide. One of the things that is obviously of concern is that the quality of education, for instance, and health may be poor in the rural areas, and that gives those in the rural areas less opportunities. And so there is a worry about a vicious circle with the divide, unless there is strong government intervention, divides growing larger and larger. One aspect that this takes is, we live in a very science-oriented society, and two important aspects of science are climate change and evolution. And there are parts of the country where they clip out those chapters out of the textbooks. And obviously students growing up in parts of the country where there's not the respect for science are going to come with be disadvantaged when it comes to dealing with a 21st century society where expertise in science are going to be very critical.
Great. The CAA asks, what type of social welfare policy should the U.S. use to counteract the continued inequality? Should we try and implement a European-style social welfare politics, maybe like that in Northern Europe?
Yeah, I think that Northern Europe has clearly done much better in developing systems of social protection. There's big differences across the various Northern European countries. Finland has done a fantastic job in its educational system. And there are weaknesses now showing in Sweden, where they've relied excessively on private education. Finland is mostly a public-oriented educational system. I mentioned before Sweden's success in its active labor market policies and its industrial policies. Denmark has done a very good job in worker protection. So each of these countries has explored various aspects and developed, with some success, various aspects of a good social protection system. We ought to be learning from what has been going on elsewhere and craft out of those many, many lessons what would work best in the United States. You can't just cut and paste, but you have to adapt. One example, when COVID-19 started, and it was clear that it was going to have a very big impact, people were going to be losing their jobs if we didn't do anything. There were some countries like Denmark and New Zealand that not only responded to the pandemic much more effectively than the United States, but also were very thoughtful in how to mitigate, how to manage the economic aftermath. And one of the things that both of them did was to try to do as much as they could to maintain workers' connections with their employers. And this was important a number of reasons, one of which was when the recovery began, pandemic was put under control, it would enable a faster restart to the economy. For the United States, it was even more important because we rely more than other countries on employer-provided health care, health insurance. So it was even more important that we do something along those lines. Regrettably, we didn't follow the Danish or the New Zealand model or the French model. Those countries managed to avoid the spike in unemployment. America really did excel in this. We had the largest increase of unemployment of any advanced country. It's going to have a long-term effect, and it's clearly increased the suffering as a result of the pandemic. And I had argued that we ought to be really looking at the Danish model. But when you had one of the parties focused on giving a payroll tax cut as the solution, when the problem was the people who would otherwise be unemployed, we really didn't understand what the fundamental issues were. It's no surprise that what we got in the form of what was called the PPP program, which gave billions of dollars to the banks to administer it so they could give money to those who were more connected. We wound up with a program that was badly designed and very badly implemented.
Thanks. I guess looking at growth, once we start to have growth again, we're always concerned about trying to get robust growth, but is it possible to expect that growth to be robust in the future? And how can we have kind of continuous growth without damaging the climate? We have a couple of people who are interested in kind of renewable energies. Could we see some kind of infrastructure jobs program that might use renewable energy to both employ people and increase growth in the economy?
Yeah, as I said before, I really think that one can get a strong growth through a green transition. That the green transition is really can be a growth story if it's well managed. Now, it won't be the same kind of growth that we have. It won't be based on the same sectors. It won't be based on producing a lot of commodities. And when you look at growth, I don't think GDP is a good measure of what we ought to be aiming at. Its well-being, and well-being can be affected by our health, by the divisions in our society, by our environment. So there are many, many aspects of growth. And when I talk about growth, I mean growth in standards of living, which go well beyond material well-being.
We have a few questions about how do we pay for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and defense, while also funding the kind of efforts that you've mentioned tonight, and looking at kind of the Northern European style social welfare system. People say that it wouldn't work because the taxes would be too high. I also read a lot about modern monetary theory, so I don't know if that's one topic that might be able to address, or do you think that that wouldn't work so well in the US?
Well, first of all, we pay a high price for not having a better system of social protection, education, and as I said, we pay a high price in many, many ways. A less healthy population labor force is not as productive of a labor force. A less well-educated labor force is not as productive a labor force. So the failure of the United States to have a good system of, you might call it welfare system. And I use welfare in a very broad way, including both social protection, health, education, the whole gamut. We are paying a very high price. We have a lower growth as a result. But you can see it even in the, what you might call the microeconomics of this. The United States spends about 18% of GDP on healthcare. Per capita, we spend almost twice as much as France, and we get poor results. Why is that? It goes back to this notion of rent seeking that I mentioned before, exploitation. Our drug companies are ripping us off, to put it very bluntly. So we're paying a price, but it's not going to our well-being. So there are better ways of organizing some sectors of the economy. I don't want to sound political, but Trump University was not a great university. It didn't deliver. And the same thing is broadly true of our private for-profit universities. Our private not-for-profit universities actually are among the best universities in the world. But the for-profit universities, which live off of actually student loans, and we've been trying to regulate for a quarter century, but these special interests have been blocking that regulation that would demand that if they're going to get government loans, they have to deliver. They have to deliver an education that results in jobs. So this goes back to the general theme. We pay more for these services in the way our economy is organized today than we would pay in other ways of having it organized. So that lowers our standard of living. Our GDP may be high, but our life expectancy is among the lowest in the advanced countries and is declining. Lower today than it was 5 years ago. Now, can we afford to do some of the things that I've talked about? Yes, but it means that we will have to change some of the ways, some of the things that we do. So what are some of the changes? I think we could we could have a smaller but more effective military defense establishment. You know, we are spending lots of money on weapons that don't work against enemies that don't exist. The Cold War has been over for 30 years. We have new threats, new security threats. The pandemic has done more to weaken our economy than any enemy could have done. And that's why the Office of Pandemics was in the National Security Council. We have cybersecurity threats. Those are expensive, but by no means anywhere near as expensive as the old armaments industries were. So we could have a stronger military targeted against the real threats that we face today. And if we taxed some of the bad things, if we had a tax on excessive speculation, if we had a tax on pollution, if we just introduced a fair tax so that people who work for a living don't have to pay more than people who speculate. Warren Buffett put it very, forcefully. Why should he be paying a lower tax rate than his secretary? If we introduced a fair tax, we would have, these taxes would enable us, these changes that I've described, enable us to have all the things that I've described and and more.
So we have a few questions of people wanting to know if you think that this field of economics and economic education is prepared to consider alternative and robust solutions to address these issues of inequality. And I'm wondering, since you both are professors, Professor Stiglitz, if you can talk about how the business school might be able to teach ethics in economics, and Professor Edsall, if you can also speak to it for the School of Journalism.
Well, I do think there is increasing interest in inequality in economics among the younger generation. It gives me a great deal of hope. You know, when I went into economics, partly because I was concerned about inequality. I've seen high levels of inequality as I was growing up. I saw massive discrimination. And this seemed to me the real problems I wanted to devote my life to. But in the subsequent decades, the economics profession moved in a totally different direction. Inequality was not discussed at all in the standard courses. In the last 5-10 years, I've taught a required PhD course in which we have a unit on inequality. And the younger people are clearly very interested in the subject. And you see people like Piketty getting an enormous amount of attention. And we're doing a webinar tomorrow, actually, together. So there's a lot of interest in the issues of inequality and a lot of good research going on. On the particular issue that you asked about ethics, in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, there were efforts in Columbia and many other business schools to introduce courses in ethics. They've continued, but I think the energy that was behind those in 2008, 9, and 10 has somewhat come out of the air. And I think this is really a time that maybe we should bring a focus again on ethics as we see the accumulation of problems, of ethical problems in sector after sector. It's not just the financial sector. It's in so many sectors of the economy. And it comes at a good time, as I say, as the Business Roundtable says, that you should not just be focusing on shareholder value. They're talking about focusing on your customers and on your community, on your workers. Important issues of how do people in the business community think about their responsibilities, their ethical responsibilities to all the stakeholders in our society.
I would just add that in journalism, the 2008 collapse really forced a lot of people, myself included, I was teaching at Columbia then, to rethink the lack of economic knowledge among journalists, myself included. And I think it also helped inspire an increasing interest in inequality, including in Professor Stiglitz's work and Thomas Piketty's work, which has gotten much more attention than it might have in the past prior to the collapse. But understanding American politics, for one, which is sort of my specialty, economics became crucial at that point, and I am still struggling trying to correct for an education where I did not take any economics courses.
Okay, we only have time for a few more questions, but this comes up in many of our webinars. All of our attendees want to get involved or make a difference in their local communities. So is there anything that you can recommend to our alumni on how they can make a difference in their local community to help reduce inequality, or anything that we've kind of talked about today that they could do by themselves? Well,
one way of thinking about it is we all play multiple roles in our lives. We are now very aware of our role as citizens, voting, how we exercise that, we go out and vote, and we exercise that vote in ways that can create a more equal society. That's really important. As I said over and over again, the writing the rules of the game is really important. Some of us have a role as an employer. And, you know, whether it's your household help or whether it's your somebody who's working for you, I've always thought it's really important to make sure they get decent pay, livable wages, that structure the job in ways that it gives them educational opportunities to learn so that they can move up. And when I think about equality, I think about it in a very, very broad way. I mentioned several times quality of life. And part of the quality of life is respect. And having respect for everybody is something that really is important. And we've seen it in this crisis. People, low-wage workers, are some of the people that we depend most on. We've seen that, and yet they're exposing themselves most during this crisis. And we have to ask the question, why are they paid so low wage when they're doing some of the hardest work and some of the most essential work? And if we reflect on that a little bit, I think maybe we can all work towards creating in our own little way a better society in which there is really meaningful more equality.
Great. I think we can get a couple more in. Judson McLaury says that you've talked about the need for government to temper and tame markets, but this requires greater trust in government among the population. So we who are concerned about this increase or decrease in popular trust in the government, what can we do to try and increase that trust in government that they'll do the right thing?
So the first thing is you have to elect a trustworthy government. And so to me, this election is so important. Having a trustworthy government is obviously a key point. But then this speaks to how we run government, how we structure government. The role of institutions is absolutely vital. So we need transparency, we need accountability, we need checks and balances. We need systems where, we had systems, we thought, where we had inspectors generals that would look and provide checks to make sure that everybody who in the public service was actually doing what they were supposed to do and not doing what they're not supposed to do. So what I think we've learned in the past 4 years, that good institutions need constant care. And that means that we can't take our eye off the ball, even for a short period of time. And so that we have to constantly renew our institutions and renew our commitments to transparency and accountability and the systems of checks and balances. And finally, particularly when it comes to trust in government, there won't be trust in government if people believe that the government is rigged, if they believe that the government represents special interests. And that's why we have to do what we can to get money out of politics. and particularly we need to curb the extremes of inequality in our society. And but we will never do that as well as we need to. And in the meanwhile, we have to make sure that the corporations, special interests, don't shape our government to their purpose.
Okay, I'm going to do something a little unfair, but I'm going to ask if you can do some rapid fire answers. So I'm going to do a couple of questions if you can answer just in a couple sentences. So Alex Leibowitz asks, do you think a wealth tax is a good way to promote equality?
Yes.
Okay.
Go
ahead.
Well, I think the modest kind of wealth tax that Elizabeth Warren talked about, a couple percent for those who have more than 50 million, and a little higher for those who have more than $1 billion. I think that will help promote equality and won't have any devastating effect on economic growth.
Great. Mina Marifat asks if you could give the most important piece of advice you could give to the incoming administration, what would it be?
Oh, that's a really hard question. I guess we have to reform our politics before we can reform our economics. You know, I'm an economist, but I think that unless we restore, to echo the previous question, we have to restore trust in our political process. That means we have to make our political process more democratic. There is a democratic deficit in the United States. We have had on the part of one of the parties a consistent attempt at disenfranchisement, disempowerment, putting democracy in change. That has to be reversed. So to me, the democratic reforms are the number one. And that includes the transparency, all the things I've talked about before. And I think it was appropriate that H.R. 1, when the Democrats came into control of the House, was about those kinds of issues in 2018, 19.
We have a couple questions on immigration. And just given kind of where we are today, would you say that the U.S. is still a land of opportunity for immigrants?
Well, if they can come into the United States, and if they come in with enough resources and a good enough education, yes. But as I said before, the American dream is statistically a myth. And that is to say, the life prospects are so dependent on the income and education of one's parents, whether you're an immigrant or not, that it isn't really a land of the kind of land that it used to be.
And then finally, if you could share if there's any new or emerging research in economics that you are really excited by and that you're following, or if there are specific people that we should read and follow as well.
Oh, there's a lot of good research going on. The 2008 financial crisis exposed the flaws in the mainstream macroeconomics profession. And there is a lot of good work going on, not as much as I would have liked, but there is some very good work going on trying to redo the foundations of macroeconomics. The work of Piketty and his co-authors, Zuckman, Zais, a whole group of scholars around the world has really used new data sources to understand the degree of inequality in our society, each of our societies. So that is really exciting work, and I've been engaged in work trying to understand the theoretical aspects, what gives rise to this inequality. But the nature of this is an important direction. A third really important and exciting area is behavioral economics. A pillar of economics for a very long time has been the idea that individuals are hyper-rational, master calculators. Evidence for the last 30, 40, 50 years has been that's not true. We've gotten more and more empirical evidence. But now we have been going the next step to understand better both what does drive behavior and how to incorporate these broader insights, behavioral insights, into economic models, both micro and macroeconomic models. So those are just three examples of some of the exciting work that is going on. Some of these people have been writing accessible, popular books. I can think of a number of good books that have come out recently. The Kay Steaton book about deaths of despair, Piketty's books about inequality. Lots of books have come out about inequality. So I guess that there's actually a very long, accessible list of economics books. I don't say very accessible, but accessible, not technical, that actually describes some of the exciting work going on in economics today.
Amazing. And you mentioned that you're doing a webinar tomorrow with Thomas Piketty. Is that by chance open to the public that some of us could attend?
I don't know, actually. It's organized through Le Monde magazine in Paris. And if you go to their website, I'm sure you can find it, or write to my office. So I actually can't answer that question.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Stiglitz and Professor Edsall. It's been wonderful to have you.
And
Pleasure being with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for being generous with your time. I just want to mention that the recording of this proceedings will be posted on our YouTube channel tomorrow, and you will receive an email. If no other comments, thank you so much, Professor Stiglitz. Thank you so much, Professor Edsall, and everyone else for attending.
Thank you. Thank you.